In the middle of a crowded hospital lobby, Chief Dr. Marcus kicked over a bucket of dirty water and ordered a cleaning woman named Elena to kneel down and wipe his shoes. She refused. Marcus tore the employee badge from her chest called security and announced that people like her did not belong in a hospital this respected. Elena said nothing. She bent down, picked up her father's old bracelet along with the torn badge from the floor, and walked away carrying a secret Marcus could never have imagined the woman he had just humiliated owned the entire hospital. If you want to see exactly how far this goes, stay with me to the end, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The badge Marcus tore from Elena's chest still sat in the pocket of her uniform when she walked out of St. Victoria Hospital that morning, and nobody in that lobby knew her real name was not Lena at all but Elena Carter, the sole heir to Carter Medical Group and the only person alive who legally owned every wall, every bed, and every paycheck inside that building. Her father, Dr. Samuel Carter, had built St. Victoria decades earlier out of a conviction that had never left Elena since she was a child, that a hospital's worth should never be measured by how it treated the powerful but by how it treated the person nobody else bothered to notice. He used to tell her that the real test of a doctor was not what happened in the operating room, but what happened in the hallway when no one important was watching. After he passed away, Elena inherited his company, but she never inherited his instinct for walking those hallways herself. She signed documents. She approved budgets. She read reports written by people who had learned exactly what she wanted to hear. That distance was what had allowed the anonymous complaints to pile up on her desk for months without her fully understanding what they meant. Nurses quietly reassigned after asking too many questions. Patients without insurance sent away with vague excuses. Community funding that seemed to shrink every quarter for reasons nobody could clearly explain. Any one of these things alone might have been an accident, a budget error, a misunderstanding. Together, they formed a pattern that Elena could not ignore, and a pattern she could not trust anyone inside the hospital to explain honestly if she asked as herself. So she did not ask as herself. She asked her attorney, a careful and steady man named Solomon Reed, to arrange something unconventional. Within a week, a new cleaning employee named Lena appeared on the janitorial staff of St. Victoria, hired through a temp agency with no connection on paper to the Carter family name. Only Solomon and one other person knew the truth: Ruth Bennett, the hospital's longtime head nurse, who had worked under Samuel Carter since the hospital first opened its doors and who agreed to watch over Elena without ever acknowledging her in front of anyone else. The first weeks taught Elena more than any quarterly report ever had. She learned which supply closets were locked and which stood open. She learned which patients were greeted by name and which were spoken to like an inconvenience. And she learned Marcus Hale, the hospital's chief doctor, whose reputation for brilliant surgery was matched only by his certainty that the hospital existed to serve his own advancement rather than the other way around. One evening, mopping the hallway outside the intensive care unit, Elena watched a young nurse rush toward Marcus with a report that was 5 minutes late. He did not raise his voice so much as let it drop into something colder, telling her in front of two patients' families that incompetence like hers was exactly why the hospital's reputation kept slipping. The nurse apologized twice before he waved her away without looking at her again. Less than a minute later, a wealthy patient stepped out of the private elevator, and Marcus's entire posture changed, his voice warming instantly as he personally walked the man to his room. Elena kept mopping, but she did not forget what she had seen. It was not the loudest thing Marcus had done, and it would not be the last, but it told her everything she needed to know about how he measured a person's worth. She began writing things down in a small notebook she kept in her locker, not because she thought she needed proof yet, but because some instinct told her that a man like Marcus would eventually give her more than enough reason to need it. The morning it happened, the hospital lobby had been prepared for a different kind of guest entirely. Marcus was expecting a major investor for a tour of the surgical wing, and the entire staff had been reminded twice that the floors needed to be spotless before his arrival. Elena had placed the wet floor sign exactly where it belonged, in clear view of anyone walking through, and had moved on to the next hallway by the time Marcus came striding through the lobby, rehearsing his opening remarks under his breath. He did not see the sign until his shoe slid slightly against the wet tile, and even then the slip was minor enough that a calmer man would have simply steadied himself and kept walking. Marcus was not a calmer man. He turned, found Elena a few feet away restocking her cart, and demanded to know why the hallway had been left in a state that could embarrass him in front of an investor. Elena calmly pointed to the sign still standing exactly where she had placed it. But Marcus was no longer interested in an explanation. What happened next took less than a minute, but it was the kind of minute that rearranges everything that follows it. Marcus kicked the bucket beside her cart hard enough to send dirty water sliding back across the tile he had just complained about, then looked at Elena as though she were the one who had made the mess. He told her to get on her knees and clean his shoes loudly enough that the words carried across the lobby and silenced the conversations near the front desk. Elena did not raise her voice, and she did not look away from him. She simply said no. It was one word, but it was clearly the wrong word for a man like Marcus to hear from someone he considered beneath him. His face changed in front of doctors visiting families and the investor he had been trying so hard to impress, and instead of stepping back from the moment, he leaned further into it. He grabbed the badge clipped to her uniform and tore it away from her chest, then turned to the 2 security guards near the entrance and ordered them to escort her out of the building, adding that she was never to set foot inside St. Victoria again. Nobody in that lobby moved to stop him. A few nurses glanced at each other, and one intern took a half step forward before thinking better of it. Only Ruth crossed the floor to help Elena gather the items that had scattered from her cart. As Ruth knelt beside her, Elena bent down herself and picked up 2 things from the wet tile: her father's old bracelet and the torn badge Marcus had thrown aside without a second thought. She slid both into her pocket before straightening up, and Ruth said nothing, careful not to reveal what she already knew. Marcus straightened his jacket and addressed the small crowd as though he were still the reasonable one in the room, telling them that people like her existed to clean up after the people who actually mattered inside a hospital like this. 1. Elena fastened her father's bracelet back around her wrist, then looked directly at Marcus and asked him one quiet question: whether he truly believed a hospital like this one belonged to men like him. Marcus laughed, genuinely amused by the question, and asked her in return whether she thought it belonged to a cleaning woman instead. He did not wait for an answer. He turned back toward his investor, straightened his tie, and resumed the tour as though nothing had happened at all. Elena walked out through the same doors she had walked through every morning for weeks, past the security guards who would not meet her eyes, and did not look back at the building until she reached the parking lot. She did not cry, and she did not call anyone from the sidewalk. She simply stood there for a moment, watching her own reflection in the glass doors of a hospital that carried her father's name on a plaque inside, and understood that whatever came next would not be about a badge, or an apology, or even about her at all. By the time she reached Solomon's office that afternoon, she had already decided that firing Marcus Hale would not be enough. Solomon listened to everything she described, then told her something that shifted the entire shape of the problem. He had spent the past several weeks reviewing the hospital's recent financial filings at her request, and he had found signs of a private negotiation Marcus was conducting with an outside company called Helix Medical, one that involved selling off part of the hospital's operations without full board approval. Attached to those early documents was a signature meant to belong to the hospital's ownership, a signature neither Elena nor Solomon had ever authorized. Elena sat with that information for a long moment, feeling the day's humiliation settle into something colder and more useful. If she exposed herself now and simply dismissed Marcus, whoever else was involved in that signature, and that negotiation would have every opportunity to erase their tracks before anyone understood the full scope of what had been happening inside her father's hospital. So instead of stepping forward as Elena Carter, she chose to remain exactly what Marcus believed her to be, a cleaning woman, he exhaustively, thrown out, no longer worth a second thought. Solomon did not try to talk her out of it, though. He made clear how much more dangerous the road ahead would be if she stayed hidden. Elena told him she understood the risk better than anyone because she had spent weeks inside that hospital watching exactly how far Marcus was willing to go when he believed no one who mattered was watching. Now she intended to find out how far he would go when he believed he had already won completely. Marcus never mentioned the incident again after that morning, and within a few days, it seemed to have vanished from the hospital entirely, the way most things vanished once he decided they were beneath his attention. He had no idea that the woman he believed gone for good was now sitting in a small office across town with Solomon Reed reviewing bank transfers and vendor contracts late into the evening, or that every signature on every questionable document was slowly being traced back toward him. The first sign that Marcus suspected anything came not from Elena but from the hospital's own security footage. He summoned the head of building security into his office one afternoon and told him in the calm and confident tone he used whenever he wanted something done without questions, that the footage from the front lobby covering the week of the incident needed to be deleted. He framed it as protecting the hospital's image from a lawsuit-hungry former employee. And the request was carried out within the hour, the way most of his requests were. What Marcus did not know was that Ruth Bennett had copied that footage onto a small drive of her own the very night after the incident without telling anyone, including Elena. She had watched Marcus tear that badge from Elena's chest, and something about the coldness in his voice afterward told her the recording might matter again someday. Ruth kept the drive at home, hidden inside a box of old greeting cards in her closet, and told no one, not even her own son, who was recovering from a long illness in the very hospital where she worked. It was that same son's ongoing treatment that made her more careful than she had ever been in her 30 years at St. Victoria, because she understood without needing to be told directly that Marcus was not a man who limited his cruelty to strangers. Marcus's next move was not aimed at evidence at all, but at reputation, which he understood far better than most people gave him credit for. Within the week, a version of events began circulating quietly among hospital staff, one in which the cleaning woman fired from the lobby had actually been let go for creating a safety hazard that endangered patients and had caused a minor injury to a nurse rushing past the wet floor. It was not entirely a lie, since a nurse had indeed slipped near that hallway days earlier, but the timeline had been rearranged just enough to shift the blame onto someone no longer there to defend herself. Elena heard about the rumor from Ruth over a phone call, and for the first time since the lobby incident she felt something closer to anger than resolve. It was not the accusation itself that unsettled her, since she knew it was false, but how easily an entire hospital staff had accepted a story that made a powerful man look blameless and a powerless woman look reckless. Nobody, who had witnessed the actual event, corrected the story, not because they believed it, but because correcting it meant challenging Marcus directly, and none of them were willing to risk their own position to defend someone they assumed they would never see again. That silence taught Elena something she had not fully understood before stepping into that uniform. Marcus did not control St. Victoria simply because of his title or his surgical record, impressive as both were. He controlled it because everyone around him had quietly agreed over years of small compromises that speaking up cost more than staying quiet, and he had built his entire authority on that unspoken agreement. Dismantling him would require more than exposing one cruel morning in a lobby. It would require showing people that the silence itself had a price. While the rumor spread through the hospital's break rooms, Solomon was uncovering something far more damaging in a downtown law office 3 blocks from Elena's apartment. The contract with Helix Medical was more advanced than either of them had initially realized, and its terms revealed exactly what Marcus stood to gain from a deal neither the hospital's true ownership nor most of its own board had properly approved. If finalized, Marcus would be installed as the new chief executive of the hospital's operations. The community clinic that treated uninsured patients would be shut down within the year, and a portion of the hospital's land would be repurposed for a private medical campus catering to patients who could afford considerably more than St. Victoria currently charged. The forged signature Solomon had noticed earlier now made a disturbing kind of sense. It belonged to a preliminary approval document, one meant to demonstrate to Helix Medical that ownership had already signaled willingness to proceed months before any formal vote could occur. Whoever had produced that signature had taken a significant legal risk, which told Elena that Marcus was either far more confident than he had reason to be or far more desperate than his public composure ever suggested. She did not have to wait long to find out which. A woman named Vivian Cross representing Helix Medical directly reached out and requested a private meeting with Elena. Solomon arranged the meeting under a false business name within a day, but Vivian arrived already knowing exactly who she was meeting, having pulled the connection from her own contacts inside the hospital's ownership structure. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being underestimated in rooms full of men, and she wasted no time confirming that the disguise had fooled no one. Vivian explained her position with an ease that made it clear she had rehearsed this exact conversation many times in her head. She had spent years being passed over for leadership positions in traditional hospital systems, told repeatedly that she lacked the right relationships despite having the right qualifications, and she had concluded a long time ago that influence built through capital moved faster than influence built through merit. The Helix deal was never really about Marcus in her mind, only about leverage, and Marcus was simply the most convenient tool available inside St. Victoria to make that leverage possible. Her offer to Elena was simple and in its own way almost respectful of the position Elena was in. Elena could remain the hospital's owner in name, receive a substantial financial settlement, and avoid the public embarrassment of admitting a chief doctor inside her own hospital had humiliated her without knowing who she was. In exchange, Helix would take over daily operations, and Marcus, once he had served his usefulness in securing board approval, would be quietly removed from any real power. Vivian made it sound less like blackmail and more like a business arrangement between two women who understood how power actually worked beneath the surface of institutions like this one. Elena listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, allowing a small recorder in her bag to capture every word Vivian offered. When Vivian finished, Elena told her plainly that she had no interest in trading her father's hospital for a settlement check and that some agreements were not actually about money at all, however they were dressed up. Vivian's expression cooled instantly, and her final words carried less negotiation and more warning, reminding Elena that ownership on paper meant very little compared to control over what the public believed to be true. That warning reached Marcus faster than Elena expected. Within days, he began investigating the woman who had disappeared from his hospital without explanation, only to discover that no employee named Lena existed anywhere in the official hiring system before her sudden appearance and equal sudden dismissal. For a man as controlling as Marcus, an unexplained gap like that was impossible to ignore, and he arrived at a conclusion that was almost correct. Someone connected to hospital ownership had been sent to investigate him directly. Rather than retreat, Marcus did what he always did when he felt cornered, which was to attack first and loudly. He called an internal press briefing for hospital staff and local reporters describing an unnamed group attempting to destabilize St. Victoria's leadership through manufactured scandal and presented selectively edited records, suggesting he was the one protecting the hospital from an outside takeover rather than orchestrating one himself. He went further, publicly connecting the earlier nurse injury directly to the area Elena had once cleaned, ignoring the fact that the real cause was his own decision months earlier to cut janitorial and nursing staff below safe operating levels. The story worked exactly as Marcus intended it to. Local coverage painted him as a dedicated surgeon defending his hospital from unnamed saboteurs, reinforcing a reputation he had spent years building around his skill in the operating room. Elena, by contrast, existed publicly only as a nameless cleaning woman dismissed under vague circumstances, a footnote, with no voice and no platform to correct the record. Several board members, uneasy about how a public scandal might affect the hospital's standing and stock value, urged Elena to resolve the matter discreetly rather than risk exposing internal conflict to the press. Elena refused, though not without weighing the cost carefully. She understood that resolving things quietly would allow Marcus to continue positioning himself as the hospital's protector rather than the person actively working to dismantle everything her father had built. The only way to change that story was to force Marcus into a moment where his own actions, spoken in his own voice, contradicted every claim he had made publicly about himself. That moment, she knew, would not come from a quiet settlement behind closed doors, but from something far more public than either Marcus or Vivian currently expected. Solomon warned her that time was running short. Marcus had scheduled a formal announcement ceremony introducing the partnership with Helix Medical, inviting the entire board, local officials, and members of the press, confident that the preliminary approval document bearing Elena's forged signature would be treated as legitimate long enough to secure a binding vote before anyone raised objections. If that ceremony proceeded as planned, Marcus intended to publicly reveal not just the merger, but his own appointment as the hospital's new chief executive, cementing exactly the kind of control her father had spent his life trying to prevent one person from holding alone. Elena understood, standing in Solomon's office reviewing the ceremony's guest list, that she was no longer simply investigating a cruel man who had humiliated her in a hospital lobby. She was preparing to stop him from taking permanent ownership of everything her father had built out of a belief that no patient, however poor, and no employee, however invisible, deserved to be treated as less than human. The ceremony was still several days away, which meant she had exactly that much time to decide how a woman the entire hospital believed to be gone for good would choose to return. The ceremony hall at St. Victoria had been transformed almost beyond recognition by the morning Marcus had chosen for his announcement. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform draped in the hospital's official colors, and cameras from at least 3 local news stations had already set up along the back wall by the time board members, investors, and city officials began filling the room. Marcus stood near the podium in a crisp white coat rather than his usual scrubs, rehearsing his opening remarks with the same confidence he had shown the morning he humiliated a cleaning woman in this very lobby weeks earlier. He began his speech exactly as Solomon had predicted he would, speaking about professionalism, about protecting the hospital's reputation, and about ensuring that only people who truly understood what it meant to lead were allowed anywhere near real authority. At one point, he even referenced the incident with the former cleaning employee, directly holding it up to the crowd as proof of the high standards he refused to compromise on. Unaware that the woman he was describing was standing just outside the hall waiting for Solomon's signal, Marcus reached for the folder containing the final Helix medical agreement, the one bearing a signature he believed had already secured him everything he wanted, and asked the board formally to approve the partnership on the spot. It was at that exact moment the doors at the back of the hall opened, and Elena walked in wearing the same cleaning uniform she had worn the day he tore the badge from her chest, the badge itself now held firmly in her hand. Security near the entrance moved instinctively to stop her, remembering Marcus's earlier order that she never be allowed back inside the building. But the hospital's board chairman rose from his seat before they could reach her, extending a hand of welcome instead of resistance. Marcus's voice cut sharply across the room, demanding she be removed immediately, but the chairman's response carried far more weight than his demand ever could, informing the entire hall that the woman standing before them was Elena Carter, sole owner of Carter Medical Group, and every inch of the hospital they were currently standing inside. The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to fully absorb what had just been said, his expression shifting from irritation to something closer to disbelief as he searched the faces around him for someone who might explain this. Was some kind of mistake? No one offered him that explanation because no one else in the room needed one anymore. He recovered his composure faster than most people in his position might have, which was in its own way consistent with everything Elena had learned about him over the past several weeks. Rather than stepping back, Marcus addressed the crowd directly, insisting this entire scene had clearly been staged to discredit him, that a woman appearing dramatically in a cleaning uniform proved nothing except a flair for theater, and that the board should proceed with the vote immediately before what he called manufactured emotion clouded their judgment. A few investors near the front exchanged uncertain glances, and two of them quietly gathered their belongings as though preparing to leave rather than be associated with whatever scandal was unfolding. Elena did not raise her voice to compete with his. She walked toward the platform at an even pace, climbed the 3 short steps, and placed the torn badge directly in front of him on the podium, close enough that everyone in the front rows could see it clearly. She told him that he had been right about one thing, that her job had always been to clean up whatever made this hospital dirty. But the thing that truly needed cleaning had never once been on the floor. Solomon stepped forward from the side of the platform, then carrying a tablet connected to the hall's main screen, and asked the board's permission to present something relevant to the vote they were about to take. Before Marcus could object, the screen behind them lit up with the security footage Ruth had preserved weeks earlier, showing the exact moment Marcus kicked over the bucket, demanded Elena kneel before him, and called her unworthy of standing inside a hospital of this reputation. The room watched in complete silence as his own recorded voice repeated words he had clearly hoped no one would ever hear again. The footage ended, and Solomon moved immediately into the recording Elena had captured during her meeting with Vivian Cross. Vivian's voice filled the hall next, offering Elena a settlement in exchange for silence, describing Marcus as a convenient tool rather than a genuine partner, and confirming a private takeover plan that had nothing to do with improving patient care. Vivian, seated near the front row in a tailored suit, rose immediately and attempted to shift full responsibility onto Marcus, claiming she had simply been negotiating terms he brought to her, but the recording playing behind her contradicted every word as she spoke it. 2 investigators seated among the board members for the past 20 minutes rose and moved toward the platform, their presence arranged earlier that morning once the forged signature had been formally confirmed as fraudulent by an independent handwriting analyst. Marcus looked toward the investigators, then back at Elena, and attempted one final defense, insisting that everything he had done was meant to protect the hospital's future, rather than destroy it. Elena answered him with a single question rather than an accusation, asking whether a doctor truly protected a hospital by abandoning its poorest patients, threatening the nurses who depended on him for their livelihoods, and stealing funds meant for people who could not afford treatment otherwise. Marcus opened his mouth to respond and found, for what appeared to be the first time in his career, that he had no answer prepared. The board chairman did not wait for further discussion before formally suspending Marcus from every position he held within the hospital effective immediately, and instructed hospital security to collect his chief doctor identification. It was Elena who stepped forward to receive it directly from his hand, closing a gap that had opened weeks earlier in this same lobby when he had torn a different badge from her chest without a second thought. In the weeks that followed, both Marcus and Vivian became subjects of a formal investigation covering forged documents, misused charitable funds, witness intimidation, and an attempted unauthorized sale of hospital assets. Employees who had lost their positions after speaking too honestly during Marcus's leadership were personally invited back by Elena, and she established an independent oversight committee to review complaints and protect anyone who came forward in the future, placing Ruth Bennett at its head in recognition of the courage she had shown when it mattered most. Elena reopened the community clinic. Marcus had planned to close raised wages for the janitorial and nursing staff who had kept the hospital running long before she ever put on a uniform, and introduced a policy requiring every hospital administrator, herself included, to spend at least one full shift each year working directly alongside the frontline staff. Many of the same employees who had stayed silent during Marcus's rise eventually apologized to her individually, and Elena accepted each apology without bitterness, though she reminded more than one of them gently that silence in the face of cruelty was often what allowed men like Marcus to keep their power in the first place. Several weeks after the ceremony, Elena returned to the same lobby where everything had begun, dressed once again in her cleaning uniform, mop in hand, wiping away a small stain near the front entrance exactly as she had the very first week. She started working there undercover. A young doctor passing through stopped near her, clearly surprised to see the hospital's owner performing a task she could easily have assigned to anyone else, and asked her plainly why she still chose to do it herself. Elena told him simply that no honest work was ever beneath anyone, and that the only people who ever needed to believe otherwise were the ones using their titles to make somebody else feel small. As she finished speaking, security guards escorted Marcus through the same lobby on his way to a scheduled meeting with investigators, his hospital badge long since revoked and his reputation reduced to headlines he could no longer control. A new cleaning employee nearby accidentally knocked over her own bucket of water just as he passed, and for a brief moment, Marcus looked down at the spreading water, then up at Elena, standing only a few feet away. She did not ask the young woman to kneel, and she did not say a single word to Marcus as he was led past her. Instead, Elena walked over, picked up the mop, leaning against the woman's cart, and began cleaning the floor beside her exactly the way she once wished someone had done for her on the worst morning of her working life. Ownership of St. Victoria still belonged entirely to Elena Carter, but she understood now more clearly than she ever had while sitting behind a desk that owning something was never truly about standing above the people inside it, only about protecting the ones who had never been given a voice of their own. Never judge a person by the uniform they happen to be wearing. The one you look down on today may not just hold real power tomorrow, they may already be the one who sees your true character most clearly. If this story reminded you why kindness always matters more than title, more than power, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.